Welcome to the 2023 Watershed Congress. We're happy that you're here joining with us today. My name is Michelle Knoll, and I am an outreach assistant for the Delaware River Keeper Network. I am also your moderator for this session, Advancing Equity in Water Infrastructure, River Network's State Revolving Fund Advocacy Toolkit. We are pleased to present our speakers for this session. Now I'm going to turn it over to River Network.
Thank you, Michelle. Okay, great. Hi, I'm so excited to be here. Thank you to the Delaware Riverkeeper Network for hosting us and all the partners. Excited to be talking to you all about the state revolving funds. My name is Sheyda Esnaashari. I use she, her pronouns. I am the Drinking Water Program Director at River Network, and I'm based in Washington, D.C. on Piscataway and Anacostan land, and I'm joined by my colleague, Erin. Erin, do you want to say hi?
Hi everyone, I'm calling in from Detroit, Michigan on Anishinaabe land. Happy to be here.
Awesome. So we're going to be walking you through the materials today. I'm going to give you a little bit of background on who we are and what we'll be talking about today. So first, just a little bit more about River Network for those who aren't familiar. We are a capacity building and network organization. We've been around for over 30 years doing this work. Our mission is to grow and strengthen a transformational national network of water, justice, and river advocates. We have a vision of a powerful and inclusive movement that ensures abundant and clean water for all people and nature to thrive. Our organization is headquartered in Boulder, Colorado, but we've got staff all over the country, and we work across a few different focus areas, drinking water being one of them. It's the program that I run. But like I said, several different focus areas. So we recently completed what we called our strategic refresh, which was really just an opportunity to revisit our previous strategic plan and revise our mission and vision and goals as they relate to the key focus areas that we continue to work on, which are healthy and resilient rivers, safe, affordable drinking water, and climate resilient communities. These focus areas really frame our work and how we move toward the future that we envision for people and nature. We have the link there too if you're interested in going and checking out our strategic plan. So what we're planning to cover today is just an introduction to a resource that we released earlier this year called the State Revolving Fund Advocacy Toolkit, also known as the SRFs. We'll talk a little bit about what the SRFs are and why we care about them and how they relate to our vision for clean, safe, and affordable and abundant water for all. We'll have a little bit of time for you all to kind of take in all the things that we talked about and then think about how you might apply this to your work. And of course, we'll save time for just question and answer at the very end. So since we're doing this in webinar format, this is kind of a moot. I think we thought we were going to be in a plenary full group format, but was hoping to gauge who we have in the room. Maybe if people want to just populate the chat where you think you fall on the spectrum of things. Are you a big beginner? You're not very familiar with the topic of water infrastructure funding? Would you call yourself intermediate? You've had some experience, but you're looking to learn more. Or are you advanced? You have years of experience related to water infrastructure funding. So if you want to just pop your status in the chat, just to see who's in the room with us. Thank you to those who've already done so. Don't be shy. We have something for everyone here today. Okay. Great. Okay. Awesome. I'm excited to be talking with you all today and going a little bit deeper. So first, I just wanted to start with a very basic history of the state revolving funds, what they are, when they were started. So there are two state revolving fund programs, the Clean Water State Revolving Fund and the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund, also known as the Clean Water SRF and Drinking Water SRF. Both of these programs were established as part of larger federal policies, the Clean Water Act and the Safe Drinking Water Act, namely. So the Clean Water SRF replaced something called the Construction Grants Program, which delivered grants directly to municipalities for much of our current infrastructure. So this was in the 1970s. We had a huge investment in our water infrastructure, and a lot of what we still have remaining today is a result of the construction grants program. And I want to emphasize that it was a grants program. The Clean Water SRF, as we know it today, was established in 1987 as a loan program, and the Drinking Water SRF followed in 1996. These programs are called revolving loan funds because the money in them revolves. So funding is given out primarily as low interest loans, with some exceptions that we'll get into in just a minute. And the repayment of these loans goes back into the fund to fund future projects. So it's a revolving loan fund. So the main takeaway here is that these programs have been around for decades, or funding has been around for decades for water infrastructure, but this did originally exist as a grant program. So I wanted to provide a little bit of context on the need for water infrastructure funding. So since the 1970s, funding for water infrastructure has declined substantially. The move from, there was also the move from a grant program to a loan program. And all of this has meant that the funding available to invest in development of and repair of our water infrastructure has not kept pace with our infrastructure needs. Some of the issues that we're facing right now include overbuilt infrastructure for communities. So communities that have had a certain population size and income at one point no longer existing, the population has decreased, people have moved elsewhere, incomes have declined. So the infrastructure that is in their community is overbuilt for what they need, and the cost of maintaining it or repairing it is quite large. We also just have really old infrastructure that has not been maintained, and just population loss and declining incomes across the country. So the main takeaway here is that the need, again, for water infrastructure funding and investment is greater than available resources. However, the SRFs do make up the largest source of federal funding for water infrastructure. Like I said before, they are primarily delivered as low interest loans to facilitate that revolving loan program and pay for future programs. There are several different kinds of projects listed here that are, this is not comprehensive, but some examples of projects that are covered under the Clean Water and the Drinking Water SRF. Some examples include addressing Safe Drinking Water Act and Clean Water Act compliance needs, things like filtration, disinfection, source water protection, as well as incorporating more green and nature-based solutions. There are a number of different types of water infrastructure and types of projects that can be funded either under the Drinking Water and the Clean Water SRF. And we'll go into detail a little bit later about the types of entities that are eligible to receive funding and implement these programs. I did also just want to provide us some context here about historically who has been able to access this funding and where the greatest water infrastructure investment needs are. So we know that the SRFs have a history of not going to the communities that need it most. This is due to a number of factors. We know that, as with many government and federal funding programs, the process is highly technical, it's bureaucratic, and requires a lot of capacity and resources to navigate it. We know that the communities that are most in need of investment often lack the capacity to do so, be it financial or honestly even just staff, to have the capacity to navigate the application process and go after those funds. We also know that this often falls along lines of race and class. These communities are more likely to face environmental injustice, and that includes investment in water infrastructure and the subsequent impacts on access to clean and affordable water, addressing issues of climate resilience and flooding. We also know that compliance with federal regulations is also less enforced in environmental justice communities, so it kind of becomes a self-fulfilling cycle. So ultimately, we know that the need is to both break down barriers to the process and address inequities by identifying and directing funds to these communities, also often called disadvantaged communities. So I would just want to ground us in a definition of what we call equitable water infrastructure investment. So we define it as being directed by the community toward public health, clean, safe, and affordable and accessible water. It's supportive of the quality and ecological integrity of our streams, rivers, lakes, and other waterways. It's distributed intentionally to support low income and communities of color, most at risk from environmental harms and historic lack of investment. And it enhances the long-term and technical and fiscal health of water systems, utilities, and wastewater systems. I did just want to provide a little bit of context on the bipartisan infrastructure law, which had a huge impact on the state revolving funds. So the state revolving funds, the Clean Water SRF and the Drinking Water SRF, exist, and we'll go into detail on how they're funded and how the money moves, but they receive funding each year. This is known as base funding. But with the passage of the bipartisan infrastructure law in 2021, there is an additional nearly $50 billion that's been made available on top of base funding for SRF. So it's a big opportunity. This is a lot of money, really to try to move toward closing that gap in the lack of investment in our water infrastructure. And like I said before, we know the need is huge and it far outpaces the resources that have historically been available. So over the course of 5 years, the bipartisan infrastructure law provides even more funding with some very specific provisions to address the inequities that have occurred and try to move us toward more equitable outcomes as they relate to water infrastructure investment and access. So a few things I want to highlight here. There's something called the general supplemental funding that's available under bill. So that just goes on top of the regular Clean Water SRF and the Drinking Water SRF. And what they've done there is mandated that 49% of the funding for the general supplemental funds, that 11.7 billion on the first line on either side, must go to 49% must go as grants or forgivable loans to disadvantaged communities. And we can get into a little bit later how disadvantaged communities are defined and identified. This also goes to the funding that's available for lead service line replacement. There's also been money made available for addressing PFAS and emerging contaminants. With those, 100% loan forgiveness is required for the Drinking Water SRF, and 25% of that funding is to be directed toward disadvantaged communities. And then again, under the Clean Water SRF, to address issues of emerging contaminants, again, providing for 100% loan forgiveness. So really the key takeaway here is that the focus is on getting dollars to communities that need it most and addressing any capacity and resource concerns via forgivable loans and grants. So if these communities are already low capacity and lacking the resource, one of the barriers that we know exists is the need to repay the loan in the first place. So by making more grants and forgivable loans available and directing those towards disadvantaged communities, it's again trying to address that need and those barriers that are typically faced. And the last thing that I'll talk about before I pass it to Erin is just very briefly wanted to touch on Justice 40, which some of you may be familiar with. It was an executive order that mandates that 40% of benefits should be directed toward disadvantaged communities across a range of issues and federal programs, including issues like climate change, clean energy, and clean water. The SRFs are included in the Justice 40 initiative. A lot of the SRF requirements that I just covered under bill go even beyond 40%. So it's really about how do we layer these things together and ensure funding is going to the communities most in need, those identified as disadvantaged communities. We know that EPA and CEQ, the White House Council on Environmental Quality, will be working together to track investment and impacts on disadvantaged communities in each program. The main takeaway here is just that there's a lot of opportunity and a lot of emphasis on increasing equity in this space. But at the same time, it will still take a lot of advocacy at the state and local level to make that happen. So although we have all this support coming from the federal level, state and local advocacy is still going to be really necessary to ensure that this implementation is happening and the appropriate communities are being identified, which I think leads really well into Erin's portion. So I'm going to pass it to you, Erin.
Thanks, Sheyda, and hello again, everyone. So I'm going to just touch on some components of our SRF Advocacy Toolkit and go a little bit deeper into some of the things that Sheyda has touched on. So we published this toolkit earlier this year, as Sheyda mentioned. I'm going to put it into the chat, the link, or you can use that QR code to open it up. And the image on this slide is just showing some of the topics that are covered in the toolkit. So you can easily, you can open it up as a whole PDF or easily jump to a section that is of most interest to you. The toolkit is really a 101 type resource. It aims to equip advocates to know how SRF dollars are administered from the federal level down to the state and municipal levels. It reviews the basic functions of the SRF programs and what kind of projects are eligible, as well as opportunities and ideas to improve the SRF program to better serve disadvantaged communities, especially small, low-wealth communities and communities of color. And it also includes additional resources, including technical assistance opportunities. You can go to the next slide, Sheyda. And I just want to note that we did not put this together on our own. We had fantastic support through the Clean Water for All Coalition, as well as a wonderful advisory of about 10 folks from across the country who gave us invaluable input on several drafts of the toolkit. And then we also had some technical reviewers who really know the SRFs inside and out, who made sure that we were saying the right thing. So big thanks to them. Next slide. The toolkit is intended for an advocate audience interested in understanding and advocating for equitable implementation of the SRFs in their states and communities. So we weren't intending this to be for necessarily for like cities or utilities who are going to be actually applying for the funds, but rather for nonprofit and community-based water advocates. Next slide. This is a graphic that's included in the toolkit, and one thing to note is that we strove to include lots of images and graphics to make this process a little bit easier to digest. And all of these are available for download. So if you want to share them in other spaces, you're certainly welcome to do that. But this is just a bird's eye view of some of the key points in the SRF process at the local, state, and federal levels. And you can see there that, as Sheyda had mentioned, Congress appropriates funding every year. EPA is then the one that is dispersing that funds to states, tribes, and territories. At the local level, water systems and other eligible entities are making sure that they're ready to apply for those funds and getting any pre-application work done ahead of time. States develop intended use plans, which I'll talk about in a little bit, and the public has an opportunity to submit comment on those intended use plans. I'll also note that some of these steps might be happening at the same time. They're not necessarily all sequential, but this was just a way to lay it out. And again, at that end, you can see that communities then pay back any of the loan portion of project costs, making sure that the fund continues to function. Next slide, or I think if you click here. Here's just a little zoom in on who those eligible entities are if you're curious. And EPA has some great resources with a lot more information on who can apply and what projects are eligible. You can see on the clean water side that there are more eligible entities, including municipalities, state agencies, nonprofits, watershed groups, and individuals in some cases. And then on the clean water side, it's really just limited to privately and publicly owned community water systems, as well as nonprofit, non-community water systems. Next slide. This is another graphic from the toolkit that's going over some of those key roles again at that local, state, and federal level. So depending on who you are, where you're coming from, you might be more interested in one of these versus another, but this also provides a little bit of information on how advocates can get engaged at those different levels. And I think I'm not going to go into too much detail here. We can go on because I went over some of this already. Okay, so you have probably, again, heard about all this money coming in towards water infrastructure and felt like it might be a bit of a black box. Like, what's even going on in these programs? The intended use plan is really the blueprint for how a state is describing how they're going to allot that money. It includes information on project prioritization, how they define disadvantaged community, or for the clean water SRF, how they establish affordability criteria. And also just goes over requirements, the program's long and short-term goals, and more. So this is typically a long document that is not super straightforward or easy to read, but it really is an important part of the puzzle in terms of figuring out where funding is going. The IUP also usually includes a project priority list. So that's where you can see which projects are going to get funded and at what level. You can go to the next slide, Sheyda. And again, if you don't know what state agency administers the SRF programs in your state, or you want to look up your IUP, there's a few different resources out there. You, of course, can always just search on Google, but the SRF Switchboard was established by the Southwest Environmental Finance Center, and we can share these links in the chat as well. You can just click on your state and it'll pull up some relevant information on your state agency website and the most recent IUP. And then in our toolkit, also on River Network's website, we have a table that has programs listed by the state, as well as EPA regional contacts. Next slide. Oh, thanks for putting those in the chat, Sheyda. So engagement by the public in these programs has been pretty lackluster. So there are a few reasons why that is, but especially through those formal public comment periods, when a state publishes their draft intended use plan, they don't necessarily do a great job of advertising when that is. It's usually a pretty short period of time. And for a lot of water advocates, they just haven't ever been involved in the process. So we tried to include in the toolkit lots of examples from folks that have been involved, and they share their advice and tips. So this is just a quote from Grady O'Brien with the North Carolina Conservation Network, making suggestions on how to organize your comments so that state staff can understand where you're coming from and have a greater impact. Next slide. I also just wanted to touch on another section of the toolkit that goes into a little bit more depth on green infrastructure projects. The Clean Water SRF can fund green and natural infrastructure projects, and the Green Project Reserve specifically directs that states use at least 10% of their clean water SRF funds for these projects. And those can go towards green infrastructure, water efficiency, energy efficiency, and environmentally innovative activities. On the slide on the right, you can see, again, a case study pulled from the toolkit where a city in North Carolina used both a combination of green and gray infrastructure to become more flood resilient. Next slide. This is also pulled from that section of the toolkit just to demonstrate that we have lots of examples from different states on how they are prioritizing green and natural infrastructure, as well as groups' comments on how those programs could be improved. We also have lots of links to other resources from folks, as you can see in that green box on the slide. Next slide. And of course, it's not a toolkit unless there's some tools involved. So we have a section called Tools and Strategies, and this includes a lot of applicable suggestions that you can put to use, including templates, suggestions on how to write an op-ed and other things like that. So this, again, is an example of a letter if you wanted to reach out to EPA staff, and it includes like a FAQ on what you might want to consider and what EPA's role is in the SRF programs. So that, I think, is it on our quick and dirty overview of SRFs. Obviously, there's a lot more to learn, and we encourage you to take a look at the toolkit for more information. But for now, we'd like you to actually spend a few minutes generating your own ideas to consider what goals your organization may have related to SRFs, who to strengthen relationships with, and what short and midterm tactics you might use. So since this is an advocacy toolkit, that's what our focus is on for this exercise. And we're going to actually use a page from the toolkit for this piece of our session. And I know it's kind of weird to do a silent reflection on a webinar, but please stick with us and come back in a few minutes. We're going to open up. Do you mind, Sheyda, if you, I think if you just click that link on the slide, will it open up? So this image that Sheyda is going to pull up momentarily just has some examples to get you thinking, especially if you have never thought about SRFs before. This might be a little daunting, but we really just want to think about, like, what are you already working on? What do you care about that are related potentially to projects that could be funded by SRFs, and how you might want to get involved. I don't know if you can read that, but on the left, there's some suggestions on what your goals related to SRFs might be. We included lots of examples. And then moving on from there, depending on your goals, who might you need to develop or strengthen relationships with? Again, there's a big list of possibilities. And then what short and midterm tactics would you want to use to accomplish your goals? And again, there's some ideas and suggestions there. So we'll just pause for a few minutes to let you all think about that, and then we're going to actually open it up to some conversation about what your thoughts are, and then we'll turn it over to some Q&A. Hopefully that sounds good. I can't see your faces, so thank you. As you're reflecting, if you have any questions, you can feel free to put those in the Q&A. And we'll reconvene in just a minute. Okay, well, I hope that was useful. And I hope y'all are still with us. So coming back again, since we're in a webinar presentation, I think that you might have to request to come off mute, but if anyone would like to share some of your initial ideas or key takeaways or questions that you still have, we'd love to hear from you, and also just open up to questions.
There's a good question in the chat. Yeah.
Great question. The question is there a timetable people should know to watch for as to when comments can be made on state SRF priorities? Yes, you do want to watch out for it. However, it varies state by state. These are ultimately state-run programs, so there's a lot of variability. I would encourage you to look at your state's SRF website and see if you can see any information about the IUP being posted. If not, reach out to those contacts at the state agency to get that information, because it's not always really readily available. And also with the bipartisan infrastructure law funding, some states have been putting out intended use plans for those different pots of money. So they might be doing one just for lead service line funding or just for the emerging contaminants funding. So it can vary. So yeah, just definitely encourage you to look up that information if you can't see it, to reach out.
And I would say in general, just based on the appropriations process and when states receive their funding, there's kind of a season of intended use plans that come out, and they start generally sometime around springtime, so around this time, and can roll through the summer depending on the state and into the early fall. So it really is variable, but generally states will stick to a similar timeline. So if you get to know your state's process, it just depends on how they get their things together. The intended use plan is a requirement for them. It's just a matter of when and how they do that. And the public comment period can also vary in length as well. So that's why you're going to want to check early and often, because I think what we've heard is a lot of folks have been caught off guard, or it can be difficult to find out where the IUP lives and when the public comment period is. There is a requirement for public engagement, but not a length of time. And I see New Jersey and Pennsylvania's websites getting put into the chat for their State Revolving Fund administration. Yes. So the question in the chat is, do you have any thoughts on how or whether the administrative process of applying serves as a barrier to some communities to seek funding? And I think there's two main buckets of how it's a barrier. One is financial resources of just having staff available. So I think it's a capacity issue first and foremost. It's a pretty technical and bureaucratic process, but I also think there are a few different things, administrative things on the side of like a water system that can be preventative for them even qualifying for loan funding to begin with as well. So.
And one other thing I'll note that I think I had up on the acknowledgement slide, but I didn't touch on, is that there is also a wonderful community called the SRF State Advocates Forum that meets quarterly. River Network convenes that forum with Alliance for the Great Lakes Policy Link and the Environmental Policy Innovation Center. And if you'd like to learn more about that forum, you can go to the link that I just put in the chat. Under the Get Involved button, you can sign up for those calls. And there's folks from across the country that are engaging on SRF advocacy in that space. So encourage you to check that out if it's of interest to you.
Okay, so it looks like we are wrapping up our session, but I do want to thank our speakers once again for taking the time to share their expertise with us. Have a great afternoon.